Hey guys, I've never started a tag before, but I've been thinking about this topic for a long time and sort of want to hear other people's responses. So, over the past year, I've been finding jobs in the book industry, and that means that I need to read mostly contemporary fiction. And I love new books, especially literary fiction, you guys know this, but I'm happiest when I'm reading a mix of newer and older books. And what I've found is that I've been using certain contemporary books as an excuse to read classics that are related in some way, thematically or tonally, or sometimes the contemporary book is specifically in conversation with an older work. And this could easily go the other way too, for somebody who reads mostly classics, that you could use these book bridges to cross into the current lit scene. So today I have a list of recommendations for classic and contemporary pairings or groupings. Other booktubers have done isolated videos on this topic. Jean from Jean's Bookish Thoughts immediately comes to mind. But I thought it would be fun to get a wider community discussion going if anyone else is interested. So I have a lot, let's get into them, and the first half of my suggestions are all books I've read. Let's start with a group that I talked about recently, Home Fire by Kamila Shamsie alongside the Oedipus cycle by Sophocles. I've done 3 videos on these books now. I'm not gonna link any below though, because there would be a million links in the description box by the end of this video. So just search any titles you're interested in hearing about on my channel page and you'll find if I've made older videos about them. So the Oedipus cycle is a series of Greek tragedies, and Home Fire is a novel inspired by the third play in this cycle, Antigone. This is a sharp retelling set mostly in present-day London, and it looks at the experience of being a British Muslim. A pairing I did last year was Winter by Allie Smith with A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, because the first and penultimate lines of Winter explicitly riff on A Christmas Carol, but I was also surprised to see how similar Smith and Dickens' tones are. They're both so playful and clever, and also optimistic in a way you can sense it is almost unfashionable for their times. And for those of you thinking it, Autumn, the first book in her seasonal quartet, has first lines that are inspired by A Tale of Two Cities. But the storyline and structure of Winter play much more with Dickens, so I think these would be a more rewarding pair. Then we have 2 books that will come as no surprise to most of you, Margaret the First by Danielle Dutton with The Blazing World and Other Writings by Margaret Cavendish. Cavendish was a 17th century English duchess and published author, and Dutton's book is a fictionalized account of her life. I adored this novel, so then I decided to pick up some of Cavendish's own writing, and it is so trippy. I talked about the experience in my recent March wrap-up. I would suggest starting with Dutton's novel if you're interested, because if you don't click with how odd and experimental it is, you're not going to enjoy Cavendish's writing. Earlier this year, I read Jen Campbell's short story collection, The Beginning of the World in the Middle of the Night, and its epigraph and themes inspired me to finally pick up Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. They both look at the relationship between bodies and souls, at creation stories, and at the essence of human nature. Then I have a more tonal pairing, the play Long Day's Journey into Night by Eugene O'Neill with the novel All We Shall Know by Donal Ryan. They are both of the depressing, introspective variety and involve family members who can't be together without being hurtful. There's so much tension in their interactions, even as they love one another. So if you appreciate the gloom and insight of one, you'll probably enjoy the other. Couldn't approach this topic without mentioning the Brontes. The most prominent books from the 3 sisters are Jane Eyre by Charlotte, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall from Anne, and let me see if I can juggle, Wuthering Heights from Emily. I suggest you read all 3. They're brilliant, but read at least 2 before picking up The Madwoman Upstairs by Catherine Lowell, about a young woman who's the last descendant of the Brontë family and who's studying literature at Oxford. It's not a grand, ambitious literary work, but it's so smart and fun, and of all the books that I'm mentioning today, this is the one that I look at and think, I could reread you right now. Another grouping is the novels The Blacker the Berry by Wallace Thurman and The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, alongside the memoir Don't Play in the Sun by Marita Golden. All of these deal with colorism in the African American community, and Golden's book extends to colorism internationally, and they all approach this topic in a really thoughtful way. And now that I'm thinking about it, I'm pretty sure that Passing by Nella Larsen is another classic on this topic that I've been meaning to read. And for the last pairing in this first half, I had to mention Shakespeare at some point. Hogarth's Shakespeare series is such a fantastic way to engage with his plays if you're feeling a little nervous, or even if you aren't. And so the pair that I've read is The Tempest with Hagseed by Margaret Atwood. I listened to an audiobook of The Tempest with Ian McKellen as Prospero. Yes, the universe gets things right sometimes. And then Hagseed is such a fun, lucid, surprisingly moving novel, and it's even more meaningful if you read it alongside the source material. Okay, so for this second half, I have either read one of the books or none, but plan to get to them all at some point. I haven't read this first pair, Howard's End by E.M. Forster with On Beauty by Zadie Smith. Don't know much about either and plan to keep it that way because hopefully I'll be getting to them later this year. The next example has thousands of potential pairings. Homer's The Odyssey, which again, I hope to read later this year. I feel like I'm going to say that a lot in this video. So I'm going to suggest 4 contemporary book bridges. One on a lot of people's minds recently is Circe by Madeline Miller, following the enigmatic goddess from the Odyssey. Another is The Penelopeid by Margaret Atwood, about Odysseus' wife Penelope, who waits for him faithfully at home for many years while he's off on his travels. A third option that's less on the nose and which I've read is Hood by Emma Donoghue. This is set in 1990s Ireland and is about a woman named Penelope who's privately grieving for her lover. And there are thematic and emotional ties between her and her namesake. And the last option is one I've picked up recently, the poetry collection Inside the Wave by Helen Dunmore, which reflects on death and the afterlife and references Homer in a number of its poems. Another novel I've read and would recommend is Florence and Giles by John Harding, which made me want to read a book that heavily influenced it, The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. Both feature 2 children who are being cared for by governesses at remote estates, and creepy, ghostly elements become involved. I don't know about you, but all I have to hear is gothic and haunted, and I'm like, yes, please direct me to this book. Now, I've read isolated snippets of Grimm's fairy tales, but I'd like to read them more comprehensively at some point, and I have my eye on the edition that's edited and translated by Jack Zipes. So an interesting companion to those original tales is this novel, The Wild Girl by Kate Forsyth, which I read a while ago now. And it's a fictionalized account of the life of Dorchen Wilde, who ended up marrying Wilhelm Grimm, and who was the source of several of their famous stories. A warning that this is a super dark book, although that's kind of to be expected with the subject matter. And on the topic of fairy tales, another pairing that I'm excited about is Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid with Louise O'Neill's new feminist retelling in her novel The Surface Breaks. Yes, please. On a different note, a book I loved a few years ago is Among Others by Jo Walton. Its own core story is a bit of a mess, but it's about a bookworm, and she talks about all the books she reads and what they mean to her, and it just gave me all the warm, bookish feelings. So I want to start exploring Ursula Le Guin's work. I've never read anything by her, and the protagonist in Among Others is a Le Guin fanatic. So I'm planning to reread this to spur me on to some classic science fiction. Next is a trio of novels, Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen, Rush O by Shirley Barrett, and Moby Dick by Herman Melville. I've described Rush O as Moby Dick light with Jane Austen vibes. If you like the tone and tinges of whimsy in Jane Austen's earlier work, then you'll probably appreciate Barrett's book, which is set in 20th century Australia and is about a whaling family. And if you find these whaling descriptions boring, you ain't gonna make it through Moby Dick, so it could be useful as a test drive. Then I have 2 groups related to Virginia Woolf, who I've read shockingly little from. So first, I want to read at least 2 more of her novels, probably Orlando and To the Lighthouse, before picking up the contemporary novel Vanessa and Her Sister by Priya Palmer, about Vanessa Bell, who was Virginia Woolf's sister. And then for the second group, I have Mrs. Dalloway, and 2 contemporary books inspired by it, The Hours by Michael Cunningham and Johannesburg by Fiona Melrose, and I'm so excited by the idea of seeing how these intertwine. And lastly, I couldn't make this type of video without mentioning possibly my favorite author, George Eliot, so I'm pairing Middlemarch with My Life in Middlemarch by Rebecca Mead, who's a journalist for The New Yorker, and who wrote this as a mix of biography and memoir. Middlemarch was one of my favorite books of last year, so I can't wait to revisit it through Mead's story. That's it. This video is really long, but as soon as I sat down to think about these possible pairings, I found that I had a ton. I'm tagging a boatload of people in the description box. Because this is my first original tag, I'm feeling a little like a middle schooler throwing her first party, like, will anyone show up? But I've been sketchy in the past about doing tags, so I guess it would be kind of karmic if no one else did this. Anyway, for anyone interested, feel free to take this in any direction you want. Pairings can be as obvious or as unconventional as you choose. You don't have to do nearly as many as I did. You could just do 2 or 3 and call it a day. I clearly highlighted literary fiction, but you could easily mix in a lot more nonfiction and genre fiction. My list is also super white and hyper-focused on British and American writers, so again, I'd be excited to see people mix things up. And I have a flexible idea of classics, so I say feel free to throw in modern classics. The idea is just to bridge older and newer books. If I haven't tagged you but you end up doing this, definitely leave a comment below saying, hey, I made this video. Maybe don't leave a link because that can send it directly to my spam folder, but I'll be sure to head over to your channel to watch. And for commenters, let me know what you think about any of these recommendations, or if you do the same thing where you pair classic and contemporary books. So that's everything. Bye guys. Thanks for watching.